Imagine Alternatives is a set of games that use storytelling, map-making, and play to imagine alternative climate futures. And for me, one of the impulses is that when you create space for somebody to imagine the future, when you give them just a blank page, often the future that they imagine, it's not really their own. They might feel like it's their own, tentatively, nervously, because it seems to have come from their heart. But of course, you reach for the images and the ideas that are in the media that you've encountered, that are in the stories that you've heard already. So I felt that it isn't enough just to create a blank space and some time. I felt that we needed to create some resources, some prompts. But this also indicates the kind of the importance of collaboration. Sometimes you don't really know. Sometimes an idea or a feeling or a thought is not really your own until you've encountered how others experience it. And even better if you can pass that idea, that image back and forth, and get excited and feel many different things about it and depict it in many different ways. So before Imagine Alternatives, or I guess the origin of Imagine Alternatives was the game Kampala Yénkya, and it began with him, with Dilman. So the first thing we did was to create one future, or Dilman, you created one future, and then we used that as the basis for this game that would inspire people to create many futures. So I'm going to pass over to you, Dilman, if that's okay. We began with these 5 stories, which imagined Kampala in the year 2060, and Dilman wrote these fantastic stories, which of course are available online and in this book, and which I'll talk about a little bit more after Dilman.
So I'll maybe just talk about the world building, because with me, I started writing speculative fiction very early on, and it was more about trying to imagine like what our societies and cultures, how they interpret science and technology, because at heart I believe we've always had science and technologies that have never been acknowledged as science and technology. But then in the world we are in today, one of the biggest roles of science fiction is to provoke thought about the problems we are having. And if you look at Octavia Butler's stories, people are calling her a prophet, but then in one of the interviews she said she's not really a prophet. She just looked at the problems that people are ignoring in her time, and she wrote about them exploding 20, 30 years to come. And I think that's kind of the approach that I take when I'm creating my stories, looking at what we have today, the problems that we are facing, and those that are not being, addressed. And 20, 30 years time, we are going to have similar issues. So there are 5 stories that I'm going to take you through very quickly. I wrote them, and then after that, I was tasked with again imagining what the world will be, which is always a very weird thing for me, because when I'm writing the stories, I don't pay too much attention to what they look like or what the characters look like. But then I had to create some graphic work, and that was a bit, it was interesting. The first one was, of course, you see Kampala it's as if it's built in wetlands, and we keep destroying these wetlands for development because the city is expanding, people need to build houses, to build shops, to build things, so they are covering up the wetlands, and yet these wetlands were kind of a drainage system for water to go into Lake Victoria, but then because they are now covered up, we keep getting floods, and a lot of floods. So I'm assuming already some parts of Kampala, people live half of the year in, they have to deal with floods for almost half of the year, because we have rains every 3 months. 3 months rain, 3 months dry, 3 months rain. So about half of the year you find you have floods and what. There's a place called Waise, And I imagine if the problems keep getting worse and they keep covering up the floods, we shall end up with water wall in Kampala. But I think there are also solutions because people keep adapting, even currently in the other places where people do have, like in the oceans, where I've seen people building houses in the water. And I think in Lagos, there is a whole suburb that is on water. So that's what I was imagining, maybe Kampala will end up like that. But then some of the solutions we have to things we have today is like 3D printing, which is, I think, the only sign on this thing, this image. And hopefully, if 3D printing becomes much more efficient and much more popular, at some point we might not need to be cutting down a lot of trees or using plastic or something like that. And the urge to destroy resources might, Then the next is about this boy who, the next story was about the return of the migrant stock. It's about this boy who finds a strange bird in the forest. But when I was writing this story, because Kampala or Uganda is the final destination for a lot of birds that come from Europe during winter, and I keep wondering if Europe grows warm, will the birds still need to come down every winter when it's winter in Europe? So I imagine a length of time where there are no migrant birds anymore, and then at some point they start coming back. I don't know, maybe Europe has gotten colder or for whatever reason, that isn't explained in the story, but it was just imagining this situation. What will happen to the migration of birds in case the north grows so warm? There are no solutions in this story, just questions. The next was Uganda has a delicacy. It's called nsenene. I think some people call it locusts. But yeah, people like it a lot. And when you come to Kampala, 2 or 3 things they'll tell you to try eating is the nsenene and the Rolex, and then the others. But this story was focusing on nsenene and how it is getting rarer and rarer because there are fewer and fewer locusts every year, and people keep struggling to harvest them. When I was a child, we didn't even need to have any harvesting farms, because the harvesting farms look like this. They get a drum and put an iron sheet in the drum, and then there's a light to attract the birds. Then they use smoke to concuss the birds, and then they fall into the drum in that way. But when I was a kid, we just would put a bed sheet under a light, and you harvest a lot of things. So, but they are getting fewer and fewer because, of course, their habitats are being lost. And I was thinking of, okay, maybe people will start farming nsenene, and yeah, it might solve the problem, and it might keep providing food for a lot of people because insects are like a major source of proteins. But then I'm also aware, like, in creating some of these utopias, there's always a very, there's a thing that humans have. It's a kind of arrogance that whatever problems we come up with, we shall have a solution, which is probably what is driving the whole climate crisis. So, and some of those solutions, of course, when you look at the Leafy Man, some of the solutions that they come up with became really problematic. But there is always talk of, if food gets scarcer and scarcer, people might create things that will be the new source of proteins, new source of meat, and all that. And so there was this fish creature, which is like crocodile/fish. I don't know what it is, but there is. I read a bit about people trying to genetically engineer fish so that it can produce a lot more foods to feed a lot more people. So yeah, in the story there's again because all the stories are told through a young adult, and they are all finding these strange animals. Yeah, it's not a disaster story like The Leafy Man, but still, it is problematic at some point to look at some of these things, because I don't know if anyone will want to eat something that looks like this. And then the final story, I think, was one where, because we are now in the future, but today we are generating a lot of trash, a lot of plastics, and there's this urge on recycle, and yet recycling it's not working. Instead of forcing manufacturers to stop manufacturing plastics, we are putting the pressure on consumers to recycle the plastics, which is a very weird way to look at things and economics. And of course, in 30 or 40 years' time, we will have problems with trash that we can't get rid of. And so that's what this other story was about. And of course, when there are floods, like the landfills, of course, will become whatever is in landfills will be swept off into the seas and the lakes and all that. And yeah, so this story is about fishermen going to fish, but then they catch more trash than they catch actual fish. I think those are it. So back to Joe.
Yeah, so fantastic. So we then, after Dilman beautifully created this world, we kind of ripped it apart and invited each group that plays the game to create their own world that will maybe include elements of what Dilman has created, but also hybridize with their own imaginations. And I wonder how you feel about that.
No, I think it was great. Like when we went to some of the schools, and then they read the stories, and then they started coming up with their own worlds. Because one of my fears was you are not Kampala schools, you are a bit in the rural areas, and some of these schools are not very much exposed to the way children in Kampala are exposed, to internet, to TV, and all that. But then it was interesting to see how their own imagination was sparked off, and then they began creating stories or building worlds around things that were happening in their village. Like there was this place that was close to the water, and some of them related very much to the water stories. But then they were like, oh, there's a lot of cutting down of trees. So what happens when all the trees are cut? And then they will try to imagine, what happens in their village when there is no more trees. How will they cook food? And how will they, get water when there is no water? So it was interesting to see that, how it started.
Yeah. It's funny because this was always intended as a game of kind of positive, hopeful futures, but I think we often find the dystopian creeps in as well, but then it sounds like people also think about adapting and jerry-rigging some kind of solar punk solution to a problem. I wonder how this work now relates to your other writing. So I know, for example, you're working on a piece that involves direct democracy. Do you think there could be direct democracy in this world?
Yeah, that's actually my ultimate hope, because most of the problems we have today is because all decisions are made centrally. Like, you don't get everybody coming up and saying, let's do this. It's one person, most likely a person with a lot of money, who makes a decision, and then we all have to follow that decision. But somebody with a lot of power, or the money people influence the people with power, and then the people with power force us to do whatever they are planning. So I'm thinking that will be a good feature that, like even within the games, we could have some. I think it was there in the prompts about what the governance systems be.
Yeah, there are. Okay. So as well as there being many different as well as there being many different worlds created each time the game is played, there are now increasingly more different versions of the game. There's the Kampala one. I've been doing some in the UK, and this week we've been creating some in Kenya. There are also some sparked off in South Africa. And yeah, I suppose it might be interesting to kind of end by reflecting on the word imagination. So this is a game which is supposed to empower the imagination. It's supposed to connect multiple people. So conceiving of imagining as a collective project, not just an individual project. And how does imagining relate to possible futures? I think sometimes you imagine something and you need to imagine it for it to become real. It can never have become real unless it was first imagined. Perhaps imagined in some detail, but sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes imagining something actually pushes it further away from reality. This is the case certainly with dangers and pitfalls. We imagine them so that we can avoid them, but might it also sometimes be the case with things that we desire and things that we dream of? Might we sometimes imagine things instead of bringing them about? And then sometimes imagination might have no relationship really with whether something becomes real or not. It might be inert, it might not matter one way or the other. And of course, perhaps most of the time, it's a hybrid, it's a mix, it's all of these things. An object once imagined becomes weightier and more real in some respects, and other aspects become more ghostly and more intangible. I've been thinking about the maps in this game quite a bit, and why we call them maps. If this is a map that we get people to draw, what is it a map to? Where can they find their way to? How are they guided? What are the borders that are imagined in this kind of map? What are the spatial logics? And perhaps how might they be different from colonial bordering practices that divide and that manufacture scarcity and that create carcerality, in other words, create excuses and reasons to lock people up? Could there be other forms of map making and perhaps even counter-bordering in these sorts of practices where the places and the spaces that we draw think about how we mark spatial difference in a way that celebrates difference, in a way that connects rather than divides? And we have some resources, so please check it out. I hope the kind of collaborative ethos of this has come through, and we're always really, really interested in meeting anybody who's interested in the project and who wants to make more versions, more futures, more stories, and more realities, we hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. And as we all can be quite difficult, co-authoring a paper, you guys did really well. So